I turned to this particular passage because I was thinking of the young people's holiday and thinking of the importance of remembering one's Creator in the days of one's youth. It may seem somewhat inappropriate for us to be considering that this evening because such young people as do come to the Bible study are all away. At least it depends where you want to draw the line. Perhaps some of you, well, we'll leave it at that. But it did seem to me, as I was thinking about this particular passage, that I would like to speak about it to you this evening. Verse 12:1 is a verse which we're, I'm sure, very familiar with. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. I think what I was really concerned about was the way in which holiday, like the one that the young people are on, does give a real opportunity for the gospel to be presented, for the gospel to be lived out, for the grace of God to be seen in the lives of the leaders, for informal conversations, for the young people to ask questions, perhaps in some cases even to open their hearts. It's strange, isn't it? But young people sometimes find it easier to open their heart to someone other than their parents. And the Lord uses that sometimes. So that's the reason why I'd like us to think about this, that the Lord would bless these days while the young people are away. Now, I'm not going to look at verses 7 and 8. What I'm going to do is briefly go through verses 11 verse 9 to chapter 12 verse 8, and then I want to draw some points out of that passage. First of all, I think in verses 9 and 10, Solomon is telling us that youth is the time for responsible rejoicing. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Now, writers do differ somewhat in their understanding of this particular verse. There are some who think that in the first part of the verse, the writer is employing irony. In other words, when he says, rejoice, O young man, in your youth, he isn't actually telling them to rejoice. What he's saying is something like this: all right, you want to rejoice, go on and rejoice, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. And that is a possible way of understanding this verse, though personally I don't think it is particularly likely, particularly in view of verses 7 and 8 beforehand. So the other way of looking at this verse is this: to say that it is true that while we're young, it is a time for rejoicing. It is a time when our hearts cheer us. It's a time when we are young and strong. We don't have the same sort of responsibilities which we shall have later on, and we can enjoy the good gift of youth. But we're to do it not carelessly, not by forgetting God, but by remembering that we are responsible to God and that one day we shall have to stand before God in the judgment. So that's the way in which a number of people understand it, and it seems to me that this makes a great deal of sense. Youth is the time for responsible rejoicing. Then verse 10 follows on the same thought. Then when we come to chapter 12 and verse 1, we read, remember your Creator before the difficult days come. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. We know that the text, if you like, of the preacher, Solomon, is vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And even when he speaks about rejoicing and enjoying the good things that God has given us under the sun, he does remind us that if you just look at life in this world, it is all empty and vain and meaningless. And so however glad and joyful we can be when we're young, we have to remember that difficult days are going to come. Days are going to come when we shall probably say, I have no pleasure in them. Up to a point, what the preacher is saying is this: enjoy life while you're able to. Enjoy the good things that God gives to you while you're able to. The time will come when you won't be able to enjoy those good things. But while rejoicing in these things, enjoying them, remember God in them, because the time will come when difficult days come. And in some ways, verse 2 follows on, but I've put it separately. Remember now your Creator while the sun still shines. Verse 2 says, while the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. Life under the sun is enjoyable when the sun is shining, but it's not quite so enjoyable when the sun isn't shining. And even when we're young, there are days when it rains, and there are days when the sun and the moon and the stars at night are darkened. But generally speaking, what happens when we're young is this. And it's not just thinking about the weather alone, it's thinking about life itself. Generally what happens is this. After a while, the rain clears, the clouds go, the sun shines again, and we can enjoy life again. But as we get older, the clouds get thicker until the time comes when the clouds remain and the sun no longer shines and we leave this world. And that's what this verse is speaking about. Already the preacher has spoken about this in verse 8. If a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. There is a time when it's shade and then sunshine again. But gradually, the shadows of death come round every one of us, and the darkness comes, and the sun's light is no longer seen. And so in verses 3 to 5, we have a picture of a house. And human life is pictured as a house which is beginning to fall down. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim, when the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low. Also when they are afraid of height and of terrors in the way, when the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails, for man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. So we have the picture of the house, which is collapsing until eventually, at the end of verse 5, man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. We can't be absolutely sure of all the details, though many of them are fairly clear. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, well, it's often thought that the keepers are perhaps the hands or the hands and the arms, and when you get older, sometimes they tend to tremble. When the strong men bow down, possibly the legs, and person gets a little bit bowed. When the grinders cease because they are few. Well, we can have false teeth in these days and have our teeth crowned and so on, but it wasn't like that in days gone by. Those that look through the windows grow dim. Well, we have extra windows now, but of course in those days they didn't have them. When the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of grinding is low. Probably the doors refer to the ears, and the sounds get low and you can't hear them as you used to. When one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low. Not quite so sure what these words refer to, but very probably it's not rising up because you hear a bird. It's rising up when the birds start singing because you can't sleep anymore. And so you get up and make yourself a cup of tea, and then hope you can go back and sleep for another hour or two before it's really time to get up. Rising up very early because you don't sleep. All the daughters of music are brought low. Well, that just fits in with the doors being shut and not being able to hear. The first part of verse 5 leaves the picture of the house, really. Also, when they are afraid of height. Now, this can be understood in various ways, but probably it's the thought of heights, of hills and steps. Mary and I were only talking about bungalows this afternoon, and the reason why bungalows are about the same cost as a house, because when people get older they don't want stairs to go up, and so there are lots of older people buying bungalows, and that keeps the price of bungalows high. But it isn't only that. Palestine, Israel, was a very hilly country, and that was a problem for older people, because they had to go down, but then if they went down they had to go up to get back home again, and so it made things very difficult. Terrors in the way, frightened to go out, frightened to walk, afraid of falling. The almond tree blossoms. Well, apparently the almond tree, when it blossoms, comes out in a lovely white blossom, slightly pink, but at a distance it looks perfectly white. And so it's the thought of a person's hair turning white or grey. The grasshopper is a burden. You think of a grasshopper or a locust, think of it, and you think of the way in which it sort of leaps and bounces, full of life. But if one of its legs is injured, then it just sort of drags itself along. It's so sad, isn't it? And this is the picture of all the powers and abilities of human beings weakening. And it sounds, in a way, rather morbid, and up to a point it is. But you see, this is what the preacher is saying. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. When you're young, life seems wonderful, life seems good, the sun is shining, all is bright, there's so much to do, there's so much to learn, there's so much to interest. And it seems so tragic that as we get older, our powers begin to fade, we can't enjoy things as we used to. I haven't dealt with that in the next little phrase, and desire fails. No longer interested in things. Haven't got the same sort of appetite, can't taste the food in the same way, not so interested in doing things, can't be bothered. You know, people say, I can't be bothered with that anymore. And this is life in this world, isn't it? And that's why it's so important to remember our Creator, and to remember our Creator when we're young. Because life is just a long series of being disillusioned if we don't know God, if we're not right with our Creator. Man goes to his eternal home, the mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. Have a lovely little lamp, you see, and it's precious, beautiful. It's made of gold. Has a little silver chain so that you can hang it on the wall. And then you put the oil into the little bowl, and you have a wick, and then it lights the house. And yet, although it's a prized possession, and so beautiful, and so valuable, the chain's so thin. And one day, it snaps. And your precious bowl crashes down on the ground, and it can't be used anymore. And life is precious. And in a way, human life is beautiful. And human beings are truly valuable, and they do things that are good and valuable, don't they? And yet somehow they're just suspended by a little link that one day will break. And then the pitcher shattered at the fountain. Now, this is a different image. Pitcher's made of earthenware, and it's very fragile in actual fact. Looks big, looks strong, but if it's knocked over onto brick or something like that, or onto stones, it so easily breaks. The fragility of life. And the wheel broken at the well. Well, very difficult just to lower a bucket down into a well and pull it up. Much better to have a wheel at the top and the rope goes down. Human life, people do so much that's useful, don't they? People spend their energies and their powers, and they do so much good and so much that is useful. And yet just as eventually the wheel wears out, just as eventually the wheel breaks, falls down in the well perhaps, has to be replaced. Everything fails, everything wears out. So human beings, so full of energy when they're young, so much gift, so much capability. We can think of many people that we've known, all the things which they've done, and then gradually it's a tragic, the way their powers wane, the way they aren't able to do what they used to do, until eventually that's the end. The dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. All is vanity. And apart from a knowledge of our Creator, apart from a knowledge of the God who made everything, life is just an enigma. And all is vanity. And that which seems so meaningful and which seems so important at human life, which seems so precious, it comes to sometimes a sad and tragic end. Now, in the light of this passage, let me just think a little bit about the verse, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth. I think the first thing that we're reminded by this is that, unfortunately, youth is often the age of irresponsibility and thoughtlessness. It's quite right that young children should be carefree. Sometimes we come across quite young children, and for various reasons we say they're old before their years. And sometimes in certain circumstances we say they've had no childhood. They've had to grow up almost before they finished infancy, as it was, because of something which has happened in the family, for example. And when children are young and when they grow into teenage years, into their early 20s and so on, there is an element of carefreeness about life, and there ought to be. After all, especially in childhood, parents are there to guide and control and take all the responsibility, to take the decisions. And it's right that children should feel a sense of freedom and carefreeness. But the trouble is that they don't always want to grow up. Or they do in certain respects, but not in other respects. They want the privileges of getting older, but not the responsibilities of getting older, not the self-discipline of getting older. And so there's an urgency about this. While you're young, remember your Creator. Don't be irresponsible and thoughtless and foolish while you're young. But then a second thing is this, it seems to me, that youth is a time which shows people the goodness and greatness of the Creator. I mean, it's difficult sometimes for us perhaps to put ourselves back 20, 30, 40, won't go any further, but you know what I mean. Put ourselves back all those years. But what a wonderful place the world seems as you grow up. There's so much that's beautiful. There's so much that's enjoyable. So much that's interesting. Go away on holiday to another part of the country. Go to a region where there's mountains. You've only lived in Dunstable, never seen proper mountains before, and it's so beautiful and so wonderful. Go to some other part of the world, so different again. And there's something exciting, I was going to say magical almost, about childhood and youth. And this is finding out what God has made. I'm not thinking, of course, of television programs and things like that. I'm talking about creation, what God has made. And as you grow up and go older, the powers and abilities which you find that you have yourself, it's so wonderful and marvellous to be able to do things, particularly if God gives you good health and strength. And so surely that's a time for remembering the Creator, our Creator, the one who made everything and the one who made us. The time when we're finding out the greatness and goodness of the Creator is a time to acknowledge Him and a time to be thankful to Him and to submit to Him and to recognize that He made us and we're creatures. We're under obligations to Him. We can enjoy the good things which He's made, but we must respect Him and reverence Him. And because we're sinners, we must turn to Him for pardon and for mercy as well. And then, thirdly, to remember God while we're young prepares people for the difficult days ahead. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. To be forewarned is to be forearmed. And the tragedy is, isn't it, that there are so many people that when life begins to get tough and hard and difficult, and it can be at quite an early age, really, can't it, with family responsibilities and so on, illness of parents and so on, it can be quite hard and difficult. The clouds can gather quite early on, the darkness can come quite early on, sometimes. And so many are utterly unprepared for that. No God to turn to. No Creator, known, trusted, loved. No God to rely on, no Father that they can turn to. Just grasping in the wind, just praying, if they do pray, they may do, to a God who's unknown. And this verse is so pertinent, isn't it? The difficult days are going to come. It isn't all going to be the carefree days of youth. So don't just enjoy the carefree days of youth and forget about tomorrow. Be prepared for tomorrow by trusting God today and relying upon God today, so that when the hard and difficult times come, you know God and you're established in Him and you're trusting in Him. In Psalm 71 and in verses 17 and 18, well, it doesn't say it's a Psalm of David. It might have been, I suppose. O God, you have taught me from my youth, and to this day I declare your wondrous works. Now also, when I am old and grey-headed, O God, do not forsake me until I declare your strength to this generation, your power to everyone who is to come. Here is someone who was taught of God in his youth, and now that he's old and grey-headed, he wants God to strengthen him and to keep him so that he can bear a faithful testimony to the generation which is to come. The next thing that we can consider is this: that those who forget and neglect their Creator in youth are not so likely to remember Him later on. It's simply a fact, isn't it? As a matter of fact, I suppose it doesn't just apply to our Creator. There are things that if I'd took a little bit more pains to remember at school, I'd be quite glad to know them now. But because I didn't take pains to remember them then it's much more difficult for me to try and learn them now. And when we're young, we form habits, don't we? Perhaps we might wish we didn't, but we do. And people can get into a habit of forgetting God, and a habit of neglecting God, and a habit of just living for themselves and just enjoying themselves and enjoying life while the sun shines. And then when the clouds come, you can't remember. You've forgotten what you knew about God and how to find Him, how to seek Him. And so this leads us to the last point, and that is this, and it of course is the whole message of the book and the whole message of this passage, and that is this: that life is meaningless and empty unless the Creator is remembered. I mean, this whole passage, and I don't really want to go through it again, but the whole passage is simply saying that, isn't it? And we know that this is so. It seems sometimes so tragic and terrible that little babies come into the world and they're so beautiful and so lovely, And they grow up into these lovely little children, and you think, well, they've got the whole life before them. And they grow up, they go old, get older, they become adults, get married, settle down. But we know that the inevitable end of it all, unless the Lord Jesus Christ comes first, the inevitable end of it all is what's happening to us all. Aging, weakening powers, fading strength. The mourners going about the streets. And if we didn't know there was a God, if we didn't know the Creator, it just becomes meaningless and empty. And you say, what's the point of it all? And if you look at it like that, there isn't any point, is there? And you can understand the cynicism of people who say, eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Because that's all life seems to be. Doesn't seem any point, doesn't seem any purpose. You might just as well enjoy yourself while you can, because before long you aren't going to be able to enjoy yourself very much. But that doesn't satisfy, of course. Might seem to be all right for a while, but there might be an awful lot of time when you can't do that. And there is in the case of many people. Remember now your Creator. Well, let's pray for the younger ones growing up, that they will be brought by God's grace to remember their Creator and to put their trust in Him.